Hello, my name is John O'Reilly. I'm the Secretary of the Kilmacud Slogan History Society.
Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Pegum, who is a retired orthopaedic surgeon.
Michael has an interest in history, and in fact he's told us that if he hadn't become a doctor, he might have become an archaeologist. His specific interest is military history, and he has set up the Irish War Memorials site. And in fact, we're standing today in Kilgobbin, which is one of the memorials on his site. Michael is a founding member of the Ballsbridge Donnybrook Sandymount Historical Society, which was founded in 2004. He has also published a book in 2015, Our Fallen Members, about 47 members of the Kildare Street and University clubs who died in the two world wars. Michael's talk today is about his life as a medical student and a doctor in Baggot Street Hospital and the changes that have happened both in medicine and in hospitals during that time. Baggot Street is a very interesting place for poets and novelists, and in his talk tonight Michael tells us a very interesting anecdote about one of these novelists. Hopefully you will enjoy our talk, and if you do feel like making any comments, please feel free to do so on our website.
Thank you for tuning in to and clicking on to come and watch me this evening. I should introduce myself because I have a very unusual surname, but my father's family in fact came from County Limerick. My mother was the daughter of a GP in North Dublin, and she was born in North Great George's Street. I was born in England, and I came to Trinity College as a medical student in 1957. And I ended up as a consultant orthopaedic surgeon in the Meath and Adelaide hospitals, and later, of course, in Tala. I'm going to be talking this evening about what Baggot Street Hospital was like 60 years ago, and to show how there have been such great changes in medicine and in hospitals since then. When I came to college, I was able to get exemption from the pre-med course, so I went straight into the preclinical course of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and I spent the first 18 months entirely in Trinity College. But my first experience at Baggot Street, in fact, was only a few months after I arrived. I was in digs in Waterloo Road, studying, as it happened, the bones of the hand and wrist, and I heard a thump outside the door, and my landlady had fallen down the stairs. Now, she'd injured her wrist, so I went with her to Baggot Street Hospital, which was just at the other end of the road. Then, in those days, it was a busy general teaching hospital. It was taking students both from Trinity College and from the College of Surgeons. It was founded in 1832 as the City of Dublin Hospital, but in 1900, Queen Victoria visited Dublin, and her daughter, Princess Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, visited the hospital, laid the foundation stone of the nurses' home, which is now the Dillon Hotel, just round the corner, and she passed on the Queen's wish that henceforward the hospital should be called the Royal City of Dublin Hospital. Well, my landlady and I went up those steps and into that door and down to the left and down a corridor to the casualty department. And x-rays were taken of her wrist, and they looked something like this. In fact, it was a collisus fracture, which was named originally in the early 19th century by Abraham Collis, who was in Dr. Stevens Hospital. You can probably see in the view on the left, which is the wrist from the side, the jagged ends of the bones, and they're also visible in the view on the right. Well, she was x-rayed, and the x-ray was hung up on a screen in the casualty department, and a crowd of men in white coats gathered around to discuss it. And I thought I would gather up some pearls of wisdom, so I crept up to the back of the crowd and listened in. And to my amusement and dismay, they were trying to remember the names of the bones in the wrist and hand. And as I had been studying it that very evening, I actually knew more than they did. They were 2 or 3 years ahead of me in the medical course, and they'd already forgotten all they knew about the anatomy. Now, at the end of the first 18 months, we took a big exam in the basic clinical sciences, and we had the excitement of going to hospital for the first time. I went to Baggot Street because I'd made some friends in the class in college who were Dubliners, and they decided to go to Baggot Street, so I thought I'd go with them. And it was a choice that changed my life, as you will see. Teaching in the hospitals was clinical, at the bedside. And that meant that the teacher, usually a consultant, but sometimes a registrar, would stand at the head of the bed, and we, the students, would crowd around, and the teacher would talk about the case, to demonstrate the signs, and invite some of us to examine a heart or a lump or a knee or something. But on the first day, we were simply shown around the hospital, and we were given a page of instructions as to how to take a history. This involved the questions you ask us to sort of, where's the pain and when did it begin? How does it come on? And is it sudden or gradual? And things like that, which actually get you a long way to a diagnosis. And then we went back to college for lectures. The next day we came in, we had a teaching clinic, and then we were thrown in at the deep end. We were each of us, the new students, told to go and examine a patient on our own. And my problem, well, I had two. First was that I'd forgotten to bring my page of instructions. So I walked all the way back from Baggery Hospital to the front square of Trinity College, where I was then living, and all the way back to the hospital, reading the page of instructions the way you see students going into an exam. The second problem was that I'd been asked to see a female patient. Now, I was very shy at the time. So I knew that when I went into a female ward with a whole lot of ladies lying there in bed chatting to each other, there would be a sudden silence and 8 or 10 pairs of eyes would turn towards me. And then there would be some giggling and whispering. And I was absolutely terrified of this. So I got a nurse outside and said, where is this patient I have to see? And she said, it's something like the third bed down on the right. So I took a deep breath, scuttled in through the door, shot down to the third bed on the right, asked the patient if I'd got the right one, pulled the curtains around. The whispering and giggling went on, of course, but they couldn't see me blushing. This is a photograph taken in the hospital at about that time. I think it's probably a new bed because of the way they're looking at it. The man in the middle is Councillor Robert Briscoe, who later, he was on the council or committee of the hospital, and at one stage he was Lord Mayor of Dublin. He's not obviously very impressed with the bed and probably wouldn't like to lie on it. The man on the left is Richard Stoney, a surgeon, and the one on the right is Professor Victor Singh, a physician. I'll be talking a bit more about both of them. The black object above the bed is the folder of the patient's notes, and that would be taken down when we were doing a round, and we would write in it the observations and advice of the consultant and report any tests that had come back. Above that, you will see the name Dr. Singh. When a consultant was appointed to the hospital in those days, he or she actually bought the beds from their predecessor. This then gave them a share of the income of the hospital, wherever it came from, according to the number of beds they had. But it depended on them having a patient in those beds, and it had to be their patient. So this bed was for Dr. Singh's patient, and nobody else was allowed in. The card on the right with the black corners, and there's another one on the left just above Richard Stoney's neck. One of them was the temperature chart, and on this was recorded the temperature, pulse, blood pressure, and of course the bowels and bladder by the nurses each day as a graph. The other one was the medication chart, where the medication prescribed for the patient was written up. Nurses took the patient's temperature with a glass thermometer, which was kept in a little test tube, soaking in antiseptic and stuck to the wall behind the head of the bed. So each morning the nurse would take the thermometer out, put it under the patient's tongue, read off the temperature and put it back to soak in the antiseptic, and would be staying there until the patient went home and next person got a new one. Something that I can't show you on a photograph, but I can assure you it was true, was every ward had an open fire. And there was a ward maid whose job it was each morning to rake out the ashes and take them away and to set a new fire with newspaper and sticks and coal. It meant that the patient in the bed nearest to the fire was very warm in winter, but overcooked in summer, and the patient at the other end of the ward had the opposite. One of the odd things about the hospital was that if you went around the wards at night, the outside of each ward looked like a flower shop. Patients were routinely brought flowers and grapes for some reason by their visitors, and the hospital had a huge number of vases in which the flowers were put. But they were taken out of the wards at night and put on the floor outside on the corridor. And when I asked why this was, and I'm not joking, I was told that it was because flowers use up oxygen. And if you left them in the ward at night, there'd be no oxygen and the patients would tend to die. So of course you had to take them out, and then there would be oxygen in the ward and the patient would still be alive in the morning. This is Professor Victor Millington Singh. The name will sound familiar because he was a nephew of John Millington Singh, the writer who was co-founder of the Abbey Theatre. He was professor of medicine in Trinity, and he was 66 when I first met him. He did a ward round every day, all day, from 9 to 5, except on Sundays. He finished at lunchtime, and he expected his whole team to be with him. The only break in the routine was the outpatients. Now, he was a general physician. He treated pretty well everything that wasn't surgical, but his specialty was endocrinology, the endocrine glands, which in practice meant diabetics and a few people with thyroid problems. There were so many of them were diabetics, in fact, that the outpatients were known as the Sweet Pea Clinic. He demonstrated once how urine was tested. Now, you probably know that diabetes, the common form of diabetes, is called diabetes mellitus. There's another disease called diabetes insipidus. And insipidus, of course, means without taste. Mellitus means sweet. And yes, that was how physicians used to test urine in the past. They tasted it. Now, this wasn't still going on. We had dipsticks even then to test whether there was sugar in the urine. But he demonstrated to us how the physicians in the past used to test urine. And he held up a cylinder of glass a bit like this, and he dipped one finger into it and put his finger in his mouth. And then he said to us, "Would you like to try?" Needless to say, we didn't. But it was the bright spark in our group who had noticed that he'd put his index finger in the urine and his middle finger in his mouth. This, by the way, is ginger ale. Not one I prepared earlier. He was a brilliant physician and a very, very good at diagnosis. And I saw him taken aback on only one occasion. He didn't have many private patients. He was entirely a professor in the university and a physician in the hospital, but he occasionally had one. And there's one day he had one and we went along to see her. She was a lady in her 70s, I would think, and very sprightly, beautifully made up, lipstick, hair carefully done, and very bouncy. But now there's a health warning here. I don't want you all self-diagnosing, but there was a symptom that was sometimes found in patients with TB, and Professor Singh was afraid that this lady might have it. Now, the symptom is nocturnal pyrexia. In other words, a raised temperature at night. But Professor Singh put it rather badly. He said to this lady, "Do you get hot in bed?" And there's a long pause, and she looked up at him thoughtfully, and she reached out and held his hand and said, "It depends on the company." Richard Atkinson Stoney was 82 when I first met him. He'd qualified in 1901. So he was born 144 years ago, and he was still working as a surgeon when I was a student. He was president of the College of Surgeons in 1930 to 32, And one of the things about him that gave him some degree of fame was that his daughter, Jean, ran off at the age of 18 and married an artist, Louis Le Brocq. Now, this is the way he operated. You can see he's wearing a hat, but he wasn't wearing a mask. He is wearing gloves in that photograph, but there were quite often times that he operated with bare hands. Now, this is an operating theatre in Dublin in 1901. It wasn't actually in Baggot Street, but it was in Dublin, and it was 1901. And this is the way that people were operating when Richard Stoney was just qualified. You can see that none of them wearing masks or gowns. The surgeon at least has taken off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. The anaesthetist, who is holding a mask away because the patient is about to expire, is just coming off the street. And the nurse is dressed as for a normal day in the wards. Stoney told a lovely story about this period because it was not long after rubber gloves had been introduced for operating. Now, up to then, surgeons did operate with their bare hands, or they wore cotton gloves to be able to hold the tissues without slipping. But rubber gloves have become fairly routine. And Stoney told a story about an elderly surgeon whom he worked with. So this is going back a bit. And at the end of an operation, this man turned to Dick Stoney and said, "You know, Stoney, these rubber gloves are all very well, but they make it damn difficult to get your handkerchief out of your pocket." A real character, T.O. or Togo Graham. He was an ENT surgeon. He was 78 when I saw him, still operating, still working. He did a lot of tonsillectomies. In fact, all ENT surgeons did a lot of tonsillectomies in those days and adenoidectomies. And he would do them as an outpatient down in a little operating theatre in the casualty department. He gave the anesthetic himself, and he then removed the tonsils with an instrument I'll show you in a moment. And I was with him one day, and he turned to me and said, "There you are, 20 seconds, 20 guineas." Now, I'm certain the 20 seconds was right, and I've no reason to doubt the 20 guineas. And just to put it in context, 20 guineas was 3 weeks' pay for me as an intern or a house surgeon. This is the instrument with which he took out the tonsils. He would hold this with holding the handle like a pistol. The hole at the end was then pushed down over the tonsil so that it bulged up through the hole, and then pressure on the Y-shaped end on the left slid the blade down. It's called a guillotine for that reason, and simply sliced off the tonsil. My wife told a story, because she was later an anaesthetist in the Eye and Ear Hospital, about a patient, an elderly woman who came in who had only one tonsil. And when asked how that came about, she said that when she was a little girl, her parents had invited an ENT surgeon to dinner. And at the end of dinner, she was called down from a bedroom and led over to the surgeon. And he said, "Open your mouth." And she did. And he whipped out this instrument and took out her tonsil. And then he said, "Open your mouth again." But she wouldn't. So there she was, 70 years later, with only one tonsil. Can you imagine inviting at the end of a dinner saying, "Would you ever take the child's tonsils out while you're here?" It was, in fact, an extremely dangerous operation and liable to cause a lot of bleeding. Now, the way the bleeding was controlled was with pressure on the bed of the tonsil. If you press on a bleeding area long enough, the bleeding will stop. And the way this was done was with this instrument. One of the pads goes inside the mouth and presses on the bed of the tonsil right at the back. The other one is on the outer side of the jaw, and then the handles are clamped together. And this puts pressure on the tonsil bed, and that is left on for a few hours. And I remember one unfortunate man who had 2 of these yolks sticking out of his mouth for several hours in extreme discomfort. But as far as I know, he survived. Toker Graham used to do his ward rounds wearing a white coat, and over it he had a huge, beautifully tooled leather belt, and hanging from it a dagger and scabbard, something like this. It was a present from a grateful Arab patient. And one day we were going ward round with him, and he had this on his belt, and he took it out and he showed it, and he said, "Do you know why it's got that curved blade?" So naturally we said we didn't. So he grabbed a passing nurse by the shoulder and raised his arm in the air with the blade held downwards. And he said, "It's like that so that when you stab somebody in the neck, it goes down into the heart and kills them." And he raised his hand. Now, I haven't the slightest suspicion that he was actually going to do anything with the knife, but the nurse wasn't so sure, and she departed rapidly. And it wasn't long after that that he resigned his position at the hospital. Our professor of surgery was Jack Henry. Some of you may have come across his son, George Henry, who was master of the rotunda at one stage. Jack was a very good teacher of junior students because he said there's one way of doing everything, and it's my way. And this was way beyond before Frank Sinatra. The teaching clinics, as I've said, were held in the wards with students around the bed. And at the end of each clinic, we had to get a card signed. The university gave us a card with the days of the month. And we had to get the initials of the teacher in each one. And if we didn't have so many signatures in a month, we didn't get credit for the month. So we would all queue up at the end of the clinic to get the card initialed. Now, firstly, Jack was a very good, straightforward teacher. Secondly, he was professor, and would therefore be setting the questions in the upcoming exam, which meant that coming up to the exams, his clinics were very popular. So popular that the ward was sometimes absolutely full of students. In fact, there was sometimes they couldn't even get into the ward. Now, the wise ones went down to the doctor's mess and got a cup of coffee and came back to get their cards signed at the end. But there was one occasion when there was a huge crowd, and Jack Henry thought he recognized a student 2 or 3 rows back and invited him to give a diagnosis for what he was looking at. And a voice from the corridor came in, "Can't quite see it from here, sir." One of the men in my year was a very serious northerner called Jimmy McVicker. And we were at a clinic one day when Jack invited Jimmy to examine the patient's liver. Now, we all did a sort of intake of breath because we had been taught that you'd have to examine a liver from one particular side of the bed. Now, it was useless advice, as I found, because when I finished my intern year, I went off and did 2 months of general practice. And I found that, because we did a lot of house visits in those days, I found that very often the bed is up against a wall and you have no choice. So you've got to learn to examine from either side. So I can't even remember now which side of the bed was the right one, but we did know that Jimmy was on the wrong one. So we all wondered, was he going to examine from the wrong side of the bed and get told off, or fight his way through the crowd to the right side and get Jack's ire up in that way? And while we were thinking, Jimmy suddenly disappeared, whoosh. And I thought for a moment that he'd fainted under the strain, but no. There was a scrabbling noise, and he popped up on the other side of the bed, having crawled through underneath. Professors like Singh and Henry did no research, and all of the consultants were part-time. They'd be in the hospital in the morning doing operating or outpatients or ward rounds, except, of course, for Professor Singh. And then they'd go off to Fitzwilliam Square to see private patients in the afternoons. The anaesthetists were mostly GPs in the rest of the day. At this stage, I was gaining confidence. I've always said that a medical course does give you a lot of self-confidence. And if I, at that stage, had to go in to see a female patient, I would simply go to the door of the ward, wait for silence, say, "Good morning, ladies. Which of you is Mary Byrne?" "Ah, it's yourself," and walk over. I wouldn't be nearly as bothered. I graduated in 1962, and this is our class. The men at the front are some of our professors. The first one on the left is Professor Seaton Pringle, who was one of the professors in Baggot Street. Then there's Victor Singh. The one next is J.B. Fleming, who was Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And then Professor Peter Gatenby, who was very popular, Professor of Medicine. And to our surprise, dropped out of the medical school after he'd been there for a few years, that is to say, as a professor. And he went off and became the top doctor at the United Nations. If you look at the class, you can see it was quite mixed. There were 6 women out of 41 students there. Nowadays, there'd be 20 or more. Quite a few black faces, quite a few from various other countries, and some mature students. So it was very mixed. The most distinguished one was the one on the back row on the right, just below the circle. He was a big, gentle giant of a man, a lovely man with a mop of unruly hair, called Seamus O'Flynn, and was O'Fodder, Flinn. When we met for our 25th anniversary celebration, he came back from America as Dr. James Flynn, and as bald as an egg and desperately serious. I'm there in the circle at the back. I don't think I've changed a bit. Now, following that, we went in and became house physicians or house surgeons. They're called interns nowadays. And I thought I looked a bit like this. It was actually a bit more like this. All of the junior doctors lived in. The women lived in the sisters' home, where they had single rooms with, we were told, hot and cold running water and central heating. The men were in cubicles in a big room, which we were told had originally been a hospital operating theatre, and it had no heating at all. In fact, after my intern year, I went to do 2 months of GP in Armagh. And one of the physicians, one of the GPs I worked with, was doctor to the Women's Hospital. And he took me with him one day when he was visiting a patient there. So I got to see one of the cells. And it was a great deal more luxurious than the accommodation I'd been in for the previous year. One of the big changes in medicine, which isn't made much of, but I think has really made a difference, was this. If somebody had his appendix out in 1960 or 62, he would stay in hospital until a couple of days after the stitches had been taken out. They might be up and about, wandering around, reading the paper, having a smoke, which they could, and obviously perfectly fit and well. But if you suggested they could go home, oh, but doctor, I haven't had my stitches out. Nowadays, of course, patients go home within a day or two, and very often on the same day, and the stitches are taken out later, and they accept that. But it has, in fact, made a huge difference to hospitals. My first night on call, I learned a very useful lesson. When a patient was coming in as an emergency, they weren't brought in necessarily by ambulance. The GP would ring up the hospital saying that he or she was sending in a patient with such and such condition. And I got a call on my first night from a GP who was sending in a patient who was having a heart attack. And I simply panicked. Now, if I'd been asked how you would treat such a patient a month earlier in my final exams, I would have been able to give a reasonable answer. But in an exam, if you give a wrong answer, the examiner, if polite, might say, I don't think you'd do that first. What else might you do? Or if he was rude, he might say, well, the patient will die. But nobody would actually die. This was real life. If I did it wrong, the patient might die. So I did what all doctors do when they're beaten. I rang for help. I rang the registrar on call, who, of course, was at home. I and the house surgeon were the only doctors on duty in the hospital. And he gave me a very good lesson, because what some people would do in that situation would be say, oh, come on now, you know what to do. What's the first thing? No. Yeah, that's right. Now, what do you do next? Yes. And prove to me that I actually knew what to do. but he didn't. He recognized panic when he heard it, and he said, first you do this, and then you do that, and then you do the other. And of course I knew it, and I calmed down, and the patient came in, and as far as I remember, he survived. There was crowding in hospitals in those days, just as there is now, but it was dealt with in a different way. They didn't pile up in casualty. We put up extra beds on the wards, sometimes so tight that you couldn't get in between them. And indeed, sometimes they put mattresses on the floor. And this was done on occasion, even for elective admissions. And there was one ludicrous situation where I was a house surgeon to a surgeon who didn't get many patients in, and he sent for somebody on his list to have his piles operated on. And he arrived in the evening, and the only place to put him was on a mattress on the floor. So there he was lying on the floor, and I was kneeling down beside him asking questions. He was apparently getting more and more puzzled, and he eventually said, "Doctor, why are you asking all those questions?" And I said, "Well, you're in to have your piles operated on." "Oh," he said, "I'd forgotten all about them. I thought I was in to have my nervous breakdown treated." If you'd gone past Bagg Street Hospital early in the morning in the late 50s and early 60s and looked up at that window, you would have seen a row of measuring cylinders like this. Yes, it was urine. The nurses collected samples of urine, put them in the cylinders, and put them on the windowsill where they could warm up in the sun and wait for the house physician to test them. We tested for sugar with a little strip of cardboard, which changed color, but we also had to test for protein, because if there's protein in the urine, it suggests the patient might have an infection. And yes, we boiled the urine. You know, if you're boiling an egg and the shell cracks and some of the white comes out and it coagulates in the water, well, the same thing happens to protein in urine. So we would put some in a test tube, heat it over a spirit lamp like that, and see if it became cloudy with coagulation. So the patients in the ward, while having their breakfast, had the delightful smell of boiling urine wafting past them. There was sometimes a somewhat unusual specimen like this. And this we could diagnose immediately was from a patient who was worried about his kidneys. He had taken this patent medicine, DeWitt's pills. And on the label, in case you can't read it, it says that within a few hours of taking your first trial, and then in heavy type, you will have unmistakable evidence that the pills are working. It says that it will rid your system of harmful impurities. Now, the impurity that was being cleared from the system was actually the green dye, which was in the pill, which was absorbed in the gut, traveled in the bloodstream to the kidneys, and was promptly excreted. So we knew that the patient was worried about his kidneys, and a lot of them swore by them. Hospital foods always had a bad reputation, although it's not as bad now as it used to be. This was the beginnings of a hospital meal. I remember watching a patient eat. It was white fish on a white plate with mashed potato, white butter beans covered with a white sauce. After the first few months, we were told that we could go and watch operations, and we knew was going to be exciting, but a little worrying. And it was particularly worrying for me, as it turned out, because I found that I used to faint at the sight of blood. Fortunately, it was a weakness I got over reasonably quickly. This was the operating theatre in Bagger Street, pretty much as it was when I was a student and a house surgeon there. In the centre, of course, of the operating table. Over on the right, the sinks where the surgeons and assistants scrubbed up. The drum in between the two sinks contained the gowns You would press a foot on a pedal, the lid would open, you take out the gown and put it on. At the end of the operation, the gowns, of course, were laundered and reused. So were the masks, which were made of cloth. They were washed and laundered and autoclaved. And the gloves were reused. The nurses would take them, wash the blood off them, and then test them for leaks. And the way you do that, in case you ever have to do this, you fill the glove with water and you squeeze it. And if you see a little stream of water coming out of a pinprick, you know that can't be used again. But if there are no leaks, you can dry it, put on talc, put it in a paper envelope and send it off for autoclaving. All of the surgery then, of course, was open. There was no keyhole surgery then. The railings you can see around in the foreground of the picture are the railings on the gallery. This is where we students would go and we'd lean on those, like in the gallery of the theatre, and it was well named a theatre with the prima donnas down there. And we could, I think we wore masks, but that was about all we did. And we could see the operation actually better than most people can nowadays if they're visiting an operating theatre. Now, this is an illustration of how we used to treat major fractures. This is a patient who's got a fracture of the femur, that's the thigh bone. And the method was to put a pin through the bone just below the knee, which genuinely didn't seem to hurt once it was in, and it was put in under anesthetic. And then a string was taken from the pin up over a pulley and another pulley and down to a weight. And this would pull on the bone, it would pull it out to length and stabilize it. And the patient would then spend 3 months like that. Now, the triangular thing above his head is a handle by which he can lift himself up so that he can get on and off a bedpan or have his back washed. And because of this up and down movement, the whole system had to be counterbalanced with more weights and strings and pulleys to take the weight of the frame and lift it, and so it would slide up when the patient went up and slide down. And there would be 3 months like that. Now, I have to tell you that that frame is relatively modern. This is a bit more what it was like. The patient was treated somewhat differently, but if you look at the wooden beams, the support at the foot of the bed and the one going diagonally across at the top of the screen, when we had a fracture femur in, porters would go down to the basement and bring up the 3 constituent parts of this and set it up so you had this beam over the top of the bed, and we would then tie the weights and pulleys onto that. If you're in bed and on traction, you tend to slide down the bed. So to overcome that, you raise the foot of the bed so that you tend to slide in the opposite direction. And in theory, it's sort of counterbalanced. And in this example, the foot of the bed is raised on a couple of tree trunks. We had a much more sophisticated method. We had some very carefully carpentered wooden blocks. 2 strong medical students or porters would lift the foot of the bed. Somebody else would shove the blocks in under the legs, and then the patient would be on a slope. The people cleaning the ward had to be very careful not to knock one of the blocks over. Children were also treated on traction for hip and conditions and fractures, and it was something like this. I remember a child of about 6 or 7 who had a fracture treated on traction like that. And we went to look at him one day and he wasn't in the bed. But we could see the weight and we could see the string, and we followed it over the pulley, down over the side of the bed, and there he was under the bed. Junior doctors in those days had far more responsibility and got far more experience than they do nowadays, particularly at the junior level, at intern, house physician, house surgeon level. If someone came in at night, and notice the if, the doctor was got out of bed and took the patient down to casualty, turned on the lights and examined them. If an injection was necessary, and we used to give anti-tetanus serum routinely to anybody who had a wound and a small dose of penicillin, we would go to the tray, which had these soaking in antiseptic, glass and metal syringes, which were reused after being cleaned, and metal needles, which were also reused. they'd be lying on a bed of gauze, and we found that the way to check whether the needle was sharp was to scratch it across the gauze, and if it caught on it, the tip of the needle was bent over, and we wouldn't use that one. If x-rays were needed, I would take the patient down to the x-ray department in the basement of Baggot Street, whereas nowadays you would get a radiographer in, or in fact nowadays there'd be somebody there all the time, but I would have to go down, turn on the lights, position the patient on the x-ray table, put the x-ray film, which was in a big red envelope, under the part to be x-rayed, take the x-ray, go into the dark room, and process the film. It was clipped onto a metal frame that you can see there, and then dipped into a tank of developer, and then a wash, and then a fixer, and then another wash, and then you could hang it up in front of the screen and look at it while it was still wet. We went to theatre as house surgeons and assisted at all the operations. In fact, I did 2 appendectomies myself as a house surgeon, assisted by a registrar. Nowadays, interns don't go to theatre at all. They see the patient in the morning before they go to theatre, and they see them when they come back in the evening, and they have to read the notes to see what was done, and they don't actually get to see it at all. Now, this all sounds very Dickensian almost, like Doctor in the House, which is a book I used to recommend to medical students. But in fact, at the same time that this was going on, Baggot Street was leading in respiratory and cardiac surgery research. Dr. Terry Chapman, who was a physician specializing in lung diseases and also a GP in the South Dublin area, set up the respiratory unit and introduced the assessment of lung function very early on in the history of that in this country. And he, as a GP, had 2 very famous patients. Patrick Kavanagh, who lived nearby, and I'm afraid I never met him, but also Brendan Behan, who lived in Anglesey Road and was a diabetic, and of course, as everybody knows, he had alcoholism. Both of them are commemorated in the area. In my year as a house surgeon, 1962 to 3, coming up to Christmas 1962, I wanted to get a present for my mother, but I was on very small pay. And I decided I would get a book by Brendan Behan and ask him if he would sign it. So I went up to Baggot Street Bridge, where there used to be Parsons' Bookshop, a very famous one. And the only book they had was a copy of his play, The Quare Fella, a little paperback. I think it probably cost me £0.50 crown. So I went down to the ward. Brendan wasn't a patient of mine, so he didn't know me. I went up to the bed and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Behan," which surprised him. He wasn't used to being called Mr. Behan. I said, "I've got this book of yours and I'd like to give it to my mother as a Christmas present. Would you be willing to sign it?" So we did more than that. To Michael's mother, from her son's friend, Brendan Behan, Christmas 1962, in English and in Irish. It's now one of my treasured possessions. The cardiac unit began when Dr. Rory Childers came back from abroad. He was trained as a cardiologist. The name must be familiar. He was the son of Erskine Childers, who was later president. Keith Shaw was a chest surgeon who came back at about the same time, and between them they started doing open heart surgery. And this was the beginning of open heart surgery in Dublin. And this, as I say, was the early 60s. I was in the hospital at the time. He recruited people there. The first one on the left, Charlie O'Neill, he was the electrician for the hospital. But it turned out he was an absolute genius when it came to electronic equipment, and he was the one who ran and serviced all of the machinery that was used during the operations. Jerry Gearty succeeded Rory Childers when he left, and David Hogan was the anaesthetist. Now, this was a very scary job. If you're going to operate on the heart, you have to stop it beating. And if you stop a patient's heart beating, they tend to die a bit. So you have to have a machine which will firstly pump the blood around through the other organs in the body, an artificial heart, keeping the blood at the right temperature and not damaging the blood cells as they go through. You've also got to have an artificial lung so the blood can be passed through that to get rid of carbon dioxide and take up oxygen. And the whole system was running on a knife edge, and David Hogan must have had a very scary time. The equipment for such an operation looked something like this, with pumps, oxygenators, monitors for the patient, and so on. And the operation scene looked something like this. And I remember that very well because I was once standing on a stool looking into the chest, watching Keith Shaw operating. And I asked what I now know was an extremely stupid question. And there was a horrible silence in the operating theatre. And Keith Shaw looked in carefully to make sure that he hadn't done what I suggested he had done, and said, "I didn't do that, get out," which I did. The cardiac unit moved later to the Mater Hospital, where Professor Owen O'Malley and Maurice Nelligan, name probably familiar to some of you, ran it. But they also set up a cardiac surgery unit in St. James's Hospital. And this is the leaflet for patients, and it's called the Keith Shaw Cardiac Surgery Unit. That began in the year 2000. So, in 2 generations of surgeons, Richard Stoney and myself, surgery has gone from this to this, which is what surgery looked like when I began, to this, which is the way I was dressed when doing hip and knee replacements, and keyhole surgery, where a very small incision is made and a television camera is pushed through so the surgeon can see inside. This is an abdominal operation, but I use this for doing knee surgery. So, Baggot Street Hospital went in 2 generations from bare hand surgery and boiling urine to frontline research and surgery. The acute services closed in 1987, and it was then used as an addiction center and dressing clinics and things like that. And the building is now up for sale. It's a preserved building, of course, so the facade will be retained. And I understand there's a condition that the new building, whatever it is, will have a primary medical care center. I really enjoyed my time there, and it was very dear to my heart because it was in that window, lower floor on the right, where I met a medical student from the College of Surgeons called Colette Murray. And in June of this year, we'll be celebrating our 53rd wedding anniversary with, I hope, our 4 children and 9 grandchildren, even if only remotely. So I hope you found this interesting. Thank you very much for watching.